Hello, and welcome to the annual presentation of the Jack Brooks Award. I'm Jeb Brooks, chairman of the Jack Brooks Foundation and son of the former congressman. It is an honor to be back presenting this award with our partners at the 92nd NY. Congressman Brooks stands as an example of an American who fought the good fight for our nation's democracy. Throughout his career, he played a major role in some of the most pivotal moments in American history. One of the most notable being passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which prohibited racial discrimination in the election process. Sadly, after 2013, many of the protections provided by this landmark federal law are being eroded, and we are witnessing countless examples across the country of efforts to make it harder for Americans to vote. Often, it can feel like an uphill battle to protect the very institution that makes us a representative democracy. But even in these difficult times, we have seen leaders emerge in the fight to protect the voting process. Today, in 2022, the Jack Brooks Award shines a light on those who work to craft legislation that expands voter access, nonpartisan efforts that echoed Brooks's sentiment that you ought to be interested in helping people, but you ought to be interested in helping everybody. This year, we honor three leaders: Virginia State Senator Jennifer McClellan, Virginia Delegate Marcia and Vermont Governor Phil Scott. Each one of them worked tirelessly to protect the right to vote in America. We saw Democrats, Senator McClellan and Delegate Price, work together as lead sponsors for the Virginia Voting Rights Act, a piece of comprehensive election reform that reestablishes pre-clearance at the state level that was previously gutted from the Federal Voting Rights Act. Republican Governor Phil Scott signed a law that requires election officials in Vermont to send all registered voters a mail-in ballot for the general election. While Governor Scott was unable to join us tonight, we applaud his efforts. I cannot say enough how proud we are to recognize these elected officials. As my father used to say, constructive change doesn't come because you think something isn't right. It's tough, tedious work. The work each one of these leaders has put forth was certainly tough. It was also inspiring and worthy of the highest praise. In addition to recognizing these excellent leaders, today's program will also feature a panel of experts who will discuss the future of voting in America. Thank you all for joining us today. Please take the time to follow us on our social media platforms, visit our website at jackbrooksfoundation.org, and sign up as a member to hear all about our future initiatives. Now, without further ado, it is time to begin the program, and I'd like to turn it over to our moderator, Jessica Huseman, the editorial director of VoteBeat, to kick off the conversation.
Welcome to the program, everyone. Thank you for being here. I am excited to welcome Senator McClellan and Delegate Price to this conversation, and I would love for you both to introduce yourselves and then also talk a little bit about what it was like to receive this award and what it means to you. Senator McClellan, why don't we start with you?
Hi, I'm Senator Jennifer McClellan. I represent the 9th Senate District in which is Richmond, Virginia, and the surrounding areas. And this award was quite meaningful. I have been in the General Assembly now for 16 years, first elected to the House of Delegates in 2005, moving to the Senate in 2017. But I bring with me every day the stories of my own family and their fight for civil rights, their fight for voting rights, which hopefully we'll talk a little bit about. But knowing that I am now a senator representing the capital of the Confederacy, the descendant of slaves and the descendant of people who some couldn't vote and some had to jump through a whole lot of hurdles to vote, to be working with Delegate Price to pass the Voting Rights Act and to win this award for our work, I think does prove that the arc of the moral universe, while long, does bend towards justice, but I couldn't have a better partner to bend it with. So I'm glad that we got this award together.
Thank you so much. Delegate Price.
Yeah, I have the same sentiments, Senator Senator McClellan and I have been working together on various issues since I've been in 2016. And a lot of it was involved with democracy. So really glad to be here with her today. I represent the 95th House District, which is mostly in the city of Newport News. I represent the district where I was born and raised and have 4 generations that have lived here. So it means a lot, not only to represent this area, but to represent the struggles and the challenges that the senator had mentioned, where Virginia definitely was front and center when we were working in the civil rights movement and even beyond. And so it means a lot. Not only that, I think this is the most beautiful award I've ever gotten. And so we just want to say, thank you, but it also means a lot. I think you never do it for the awards or recognition. And Senator McClellan and I have our head down and working every day. And so just to be able to take a moment to celebrate the victories is really a welcomed opportunity. So thank you all.
Thank you. Senator McClellan, I want to touch on something that you mentioned in your first answer, which is, your tied history to this. It's certainly quite stunning that Virginia is the only formerly covered Section 5 state that now has a Voting Rights Act. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the significance of that. How does it make you feel that Virginia is moving in a very different direction than many other Southern states?
Well, quite proud. Virginia has a very complicated history where we were the birthplace of American democracy in July of 1619, and then a month later, we were the birthplace of American slavery with the arrival of the first recorded Africans on our shores as well. And pretty much throughout history, it's almost been like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, sometimes 1 step forward, 2 steps back. So I think Delegate Price and I knew that once we were in a position politically to make progress, we were like, we better make as much as we can, because who knows how long we'll have this opportunity. But we definitely took the baton and ran with it. And I think I can't help but think about one of my personal heroes, John Lewis, and his last words to us. That democracy is not a state, but an action that requires every generation to do its part. Delegate Price and I are different generations, but we definitely stand on the shoulders of those that came before us to fight for voting rights and civil rights. And I'm just incredibly proud that Virginia is leading the way in the South on voting rights.
And Delegate Price, how long have you been in office?
I've been in since 2016.
Okay.
And so in the way Virginia has gone, though, instead of just the regular 7 sessions that I would have been able to tout, we have actually had more special sessions more recently within my tenure. So I've actually been in for 14 sessions, if you count the special sessions, including the one that we're currently in. So I came in when Jen was still a delegate. And so we got to work together in the House before she went to the Senate, and now we get to work together across the hall, but still focusing on the issues. And our districts are a lot alike, and so we have overlap for some of the things that we're trying to accomplish. But I just want to +1 something that she said, like, when we got in, we knew we had to be laser focused. But one of the things that I want to commend her on is the work that she's done consistently, so that when I came in, I was just tapping in. And so I didn't have to start from scratch. And I think for the Virginia Legislative Black Caucus, preserving, expanding, protecting democracy has always been, a major priority. And so even when my uncle served in the House when I was born, he was fighting some of these same things. So it really is that, like, I don't know that we're ever going to get to the accomplishment of democracy where we can all just sit back, but I'm really glad to be able to tap in and do the generational work that it takes.
And I wonder if there are any big lessons that you learned along the way that surprised you. I mean, certainly you are clearly not new at this. 14 sessions is nothing to sneeze at. But this seems like it was probably a much bigger lift than other parts of your work. And so I'd love to hear you talk about any unexpected challenges or lessons that you've learned that you hope others will carry forward as they do this work in other states.
Yeah, I think I definitely came in with my eyes wide open. I knew the realities or the political realities that were in place when I came in, but I also had been watching and learning the entire time, working within community organizing prior to being elected. And so I kind of knew the inside and outside game, which proved to be helpful. But I think the most important lesson was get out of the way and let women work. We were a group of women that sat down at the table. We didn't even ask for the advocates and the lawyers we were working with. We didn't ask their political affiliation. We said, this is what we need to do in Virginia. The writing is on the wall for what's to come if we don't protect ourselves at the state level. So let's get something done. We allowed to play to each other's strengths, and this is the product that we got. And so I really do want to reemphasize the role that women played in this, because we often forget to share our victories and to share that part of the story. We might be scared to brag about ourselves, but we could not have done this without the women that were around the table, dedicated to getting to a great outcome, listening to feedback from registrars, listening to feedback from voters, being flexible enough to get to the good product that could pass both the House and the Senate and be signed by the governor. And so I really do want to shout out the role that women played in this.
Thanks so much. Senator McClellan, I would love to hear about what you think are the most important changes that are going to come about as a result of this law. What specifically are you most excited about, and what changes do you think will be most obvious to Virginia voters?
Well, I think just the fact that when the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in the Shelby decision and still hasn't reauthorized the Voting Rights Act or passed the John Lewis Voting Rights Act or really done anything to expand voting rights on an issue that used to be bipartisan. And I think that was my biggest surprise, is just the day we couldn't get a single Republican to vote for this bill, unfortunately, although we tried and we thought we might have gotten at least one. I think that this now, at least in Virginia, fills that gap that the Voting Rights Act no longer fills by banning voter discrimination, intimidation, and suppression, by giving Virginia voters for the first time a recourse if their voting rights are violated. They can either sue themselves, or the Attorney General can sue on their behalf. It puts in place a mechanism to make sure that voters know about changes to the law before they happen, because we saw, even in the time period between when the Federal Voting Rights Act fell and this one passed, changes in polling places at the last minute that no one knew about, that led to a lot of confusion when people tried to vote. So I think for the Voting Rights Act, those are the biggest pieces. And then just before the Voting Rights Act passed, we passed a slew of bills that made Virginia, took us from the second hardest state to vote to the 12th easiest. And it's everything from a 45-day early voting period, a requirement that registrars allow you to cure your absentee ballot if you do it wrong, drop boxes, and I'm going to forget some stuff, making Election Day a holiday. We did more to expand voting rights in 2 years than we had done probably in my lifetime. And I'll be 50 this year. So very proud of that.
Great. As I've watched bills on elections go through both other state houses and the federal government, One thing that always seems to stymie lawmakers is they get to the very end, the legislation is written, and then they realize that they can't actually do some of the things that they wanted to do because they didn't know how elections were actually administered in their own state. And so I would love to hear about the conversations that you had with election administrators who are responsible for putting the ballot in folks' hands about sort of their changes, their feedback, and how you worked cooperatively with them over the last over the several months it took to do this. Delegate Price, would you fill us in?
Yeah. I do just want to say, just to shout out ourselves a little bit, we've been intimately involved in those bills that Jen just mentioned. But the year before we did the Voting Rights Act, there was also redistricting information. We passed a bill that made political, prison, and racial gerrymandering illegal. So we've been kind of up to our elbows in election law for quite a while. And I've been on privileges and elections, or I had been on privileges and elections since I had gotten in. So we kind of made it a point to know what we were talking about before we were trying to change it. But specific to talking with the registrars and the folks that are in charge of, administering the elections, I think, we got the green light for what we were trying to accomplish. We did get a little bit of pushback about one of the changes, which, as the senator mentioned, it allows for any of the proposed changes that aren't emergencies to go through a public comment and a public kind of waiting period to make sure that, anybody that wasn't at the decision-making table can chime in to say, well, actually, say for instance, that polling location is not near my bus route, or, something that the public could really chime in. As we all know, public input is not usually the most expedient thing, but it is the most important thing if we're going to have a representative government. So we did hear back from that. And then when it comes to some of the protections that we had against misinformation, intimidation, those sorts of things, just wanting to make sure that we were aiming at those that were willfully, trying to cause someone to be disenfranchised, as opposed to an administrative mistake. Now, we were of the mindset that even an administrative mistake, if it took someone's right to vote, is really important to deal with the systems to make sure that those aren't happening. But we did hear that, hey, we want to be able to hire people without people being afraid of going to jail for a simple mistake. So we kind of adjusted it there. So we changed the language to make sure that it was understood that this was, if you're doing this on purpose to hurt someone's ability to vote or to suppress the vote in any way. So those are some of the kind of things, the day-to-day implementation of what we were trying to accomplish. That's one example.
Okay, great. And I would actually love to hear from both of you on this next question, but we'll go ahead and start with Senator McClellan. I'd love to hear whether you believe that your legislation is a model for other states that you think that they should follow. And if so, what pieces of it are you most eager to see other states take off with?
It's absolutely a model, and I think we intentionally, as Delegate Price said, we looked at what other states were doing. We brought a broad coalition of people together to say, not only how do we have a Voting Rights Act, how do we have the strongest in the country? So we kind of intentionally wrote it to be a model, and I think the fact that it not only seeks to replicate the Federal Voting Rights Act and incorporate it in state law here, but strengthening our voter suppression, anti-suppression, intimidation, and discrimination provisions, providing the cause of action for people, to sue if their rights have been violated. And while it is not a pre-clearance per se, the public comment period does provide meaningful opportunity for people to speak on and be heard about how voting law changes or practice changes would practically impact their ability to vote. So I think all of that is a model for the rest of the country. And it really is important because we don't know if Congress or even the courts going forward are going to give us the kind of strength and protections that we had in the past going forward. So it's really important that the states pick up the slack here.
Delegate Price.
Yeah, thank you. And in addition to some of the things that Jen mentioned, I want to reiterate the ability for an affected voter or the attorney general to be able to sue if something happens. So, we don't just decry something that happened, get to the resolution. Some other things that are a little bit, smaller in priority, but still important. We made sure that the federal language requirements match for local and state elections. And I think that's really important, especially if we're looking with the census information and seeing the trends that, states are really going in, and making sure that if you're allowed to vote, that you also can do it the easiest way possible for you. We also put our money where our mouth was. We created a voter education and outreach fund. So all of these wonderful changes that we're telling you about, we also put money in order for the voters to be educated on these new changes. And so that was great. The other part was to make sure that this applied to local elections as well. So we did still have some localities that had ward systems for their elections, and those were put into place to make sure that there was diverse voices at the table. Well, if they were going to move from a ward system to an at-large system, it had to be proven that they could still get to making sure that everyone could have their voice be heard. And so I think that's really important for states to look at, to make sure that if the federal is, the federal, state and local are so important, because as we know, every single election is important, and that people should be able to utilize their vote, their voice in the easiest way possible on all elections.
Okay, great. It's been an interesting couple of months in the voting rights space, and I have had lots of conversations with state level officials who are frustrated with the lack of movement on the federal level on these issues. And I think that there is a sense of defeat that might be going around, right? If the federal government isn't going to do anything, how am I supposed to do anything for the people of my state? And it seems like you two have bucked that trend, that sense of complacency. And so I love to hear about how you are viewing the lack of movement on the federal level in terms of voting rights and enfranchisement. Senator McClellan, let's go ahead and start with you.
It's frustrating, but again, I alluded to it when I think about my great-grandfather in 1901 having to take a literacy test and find 3 white men to vouch for him just being able to register. But he did it, even though when he got the questions right, he got more questions. My father and my grandfather had to pay poll taxes. My mother didn't vote until 65. And so I think that's what, and Delegate Price has similar stories. That's what keeps us going, is we think about how far we've come because our ancestors persisted. And so we persist. And remember, we needed federal action because so many of the states were moving to restrict and suppress the vote of our people. So now it's almost the opposite. It's that the federal government has just stalled. But we really have an opportunity for the states to be the bulwark of democracy. And granted, your ability to vote should depend on your zip code. But if Congress isn't going to act, that's what we're left with. And we've just got to put our head down and do the work.
Delegate Price.
Yeah, I definitely agree. We do not have the luxury of being complacent on anything for the districts that we serve, the history of the districts that we serve, and just what's in our DNA to keep fighting for. So that was never an option. But for those that, feel defeated, the other thing is, even if you have low expectations of what may become of something, you can't stop with accountability. And this is not just on 1 or 2 people. This is on 51 or 2 people. And so the actual story of what is happening needs to be told. But again, just reiterating, if we couldn't depend on the federal government for a lot when we were coming up with these bills and the ideas for them in 2018, 2019, 2020, we could not depend on the federal government. And so we had to do it at the state level.
Okay, great. And then I know that you mentioned that not a single Republican picked up this vote for you guys. And I just wonder if you feel like there is any bipartisan ground left to stand on in this in the voting rights debate, or if it has truly become completely partisan. Do you think that there are common issues that you can tackle with the Republicans in Virginia, or are you moving forward and doing this again all by yourself? Let's start with Senator McClellan.
I mean, unfortunately, on voting rights, the past 2 years have shown us that it is just the Democrats who are working to expand the vote. Not only did we not get a single Republican vote on any of these bills, when they took over the House and the governor's mansion and the Attorney General's office, they moved to roll back a lot of the progress that we made and repeal some of the laws we put in place. So, you know, I'm normally a glass half full person, but they have not shown any interest in expanding the vote. I think they prefer to they prefer straight up power than serving the people. And I think the more we remove restrictions and the more people vote and can have the ability to vote, the better our democracy is. But that doesn't appear to be where they are right now.
Delegate Price.
Yeah, you know, I understand that it's not fair to make sweeping generalizations, but I also have not heard any voices challenge the fact that we're saying Democrats are the only ones doing it. So if there are Republicans, stand up. Raise your hand. We'd love to work with you. But even the folks that put forward a proposed constitutional amendment that would allow for automatic restoration of rights, they weren't even allowed to support their own bill because of the Republican powers that be. And 10 years of work to get to that died along with that bill this year. So I would just encourage, if you are a Republican that is really for this, we need to hear you. We need to hear your voice and show, if there is diversity amongst the party, that there are still people that are willing to work on this. If not, we can only go with, you know, what we're seeing so far.
Okay, great. And then, so given that landscape that we've just laid out in this very optimistic way for our viewers, where do you go from here? What's your next step, Senator McClellan?
Well, first we fight to preserve what we've done. And, you know, American history is full of examples of how once marginalized people gain social, political, and economic power, there's a backlash. And we're facing that backlash right now. So we're not going to be complacent. We're going to fight to keep what we've done, and we're going to keep working to expand voting rights for as long as we can.
Delegate Price.
Yeah, and I think this is a ground game, you know, working with our partners who are, you know, organizing and advocating at the doors so that folks that don't have time to watch us run our mouths during session or to tune into the news every day know exactly what's going on and understand what is at stake if they don't use their voice and their vote in every single election, and just making sure everyone is registered to vote and just really is tuned into where we are in this moment, the crossroads that we are in Virginia and nationally, for what will our democracy be for the next generation, if it even will be here. And once you have those conversations, people tap in.
Great. Delegate Price, I'll stick with you for just a second for our last question, which is that if somebody is watching this and they find that they are horrified by what is going on and they want to do something, what are your recommendations?
Yeah, I think everything feels heavy right now. We are still in a global pandemic, but there are so many ways that organizations are still being effective and still working and doing the work that we have to do. And so I would say, don't let it feel too heavy. You do not have to reinvent the wheel. Join one of the many organizations that have been working for years on issues of democracy in your area. They are probably going to be welcoming you with red carpet for new members because the pandemic has had limitations. But join in with others so that instead of one email here or there, we're getting hundreds. We're getting inundated with voices who we can say and point to. The people want us to protect democracy, and that is our mandate. And so join in on the work.
Great. Senator McClellan.
You know, I'll just remind everybody that the beauty of American democracy is we're government by, of, and for the people. That means government is only going to respond and reflect the perspectives of the people who participate. So first, vote, but don't stop there. Get engaged. You know, talk to your elected officials. Pay attention to what they're doing or not doing on voting rights or any other issue that you care about. Show up in the hearings to testify, and just stay engaged. And you can never get complacent, because the minute you're complacent, the forces that would roll back that progress for in the sake of power, they'll win. So make sure that you are participating in our democracy today and every day.
Great. I would love to leave our folks with a little bit of an optimistic note. So could we each just say, well, not me, I will defer to the both of you. Could you tell us something that you're excited about, that is like a good thing in this space that is happening, that people can hold on to a little bit? Senator McClellan.
My children are starting to get engaged and in the civic process and get interested, and they're 11 and 7. And you hear about young people being not interested and engaged. So seeing democracy through their eyes gives me hope.
That's really nice. Delegate Price.
Yeah, and I would just say having the quiet conversations with voters face to face has given me hope. The loudest voices are not usually the ones that have, the most power. And so, we may not have everyone out at a protest or a march, but they do understand what's going on. They are willing to fight for their rights. And that is what gives me hope, especially with our young people who want to be able to participate in this process. And so we welcome that. The youth will always give me hope. So I want to end with that as well.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. I really appreciate both of you being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. We're just going to jump right off. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their work, and then we'll jump right into some questions. Christian, do you want to kick us off?
I'm Christian Grose, and I'm the academic director at the USC Schwarzenegger Institute. I'm also a professor of political science and public policy at the University of Southern California. I do research on voting rights and other related topics, and I'm really excited to be here.
Great. Laura?
Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Miller. I'm a managing director at When We All Vote. When We All Vote is a nonpartisan nonprofit on a mission to change the culture around voting, and in particular, talking to young people and people of color in order to make sure that they are registered and ready to vote.
Wonderful. Remy?
Hi, I'm Remy Garza, Cameron County Elections Administrator and Voter Registrar. I've been in this position for about 7 years and have focused a lot of my efforts on increasing the voter registration here in South Texas. We've gone from about 180,000 to 225,000 in the 5 years that I've been working on it.
That's great. Thank you so much. Well, I'd love to direct the first question to David. David, I know that you helped oversee a pretty substantial private grant program this year. Remy was among the recipients of some of that grant money. And so I'd just love for you to give us a bit of an overview and talk about the impacts that you saw that money achieve.
Yeah, so at the USC Schwarzenegger Institute, we took part in we sponsored a program that was private philanthropy that was run through USC. To my knowledge, it's the first time that such a program has been done at a university in the United States. And Governor Schwarzenegger, who founded the USC Schwarzenegger Institute, was interested in opening new polling places and providing more opportunities for voter access for people to vote in places that were formerly covered by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And so our program, which I helped oversee, basically opened up applications to counties across the country, places like Cameron County, Texas, who had the opportunity to apply. Every county who applied for our grants program received a grant to open new polling places, and we ended up spending approximately $2.5 million through the USC Schwarzenegger Institute to allocate funds to open new polling places, hundreds of new polling places in a number of counties across the country, including in Texas.
Fantastic. Remy, why don't you tell us how you use that money?
We created 3 voting super centers. We utilized our local convention centers and were able to open them up and provide that space that people were looking for during the 2020 election. Having large parking lots so that we could create the curbside voting opportunities for everybody really worked out. They were very popular. We have used some of those locations again in smaller elections, And I do anticipate that in this upcoming November election and even the presidential election coming, the Commissioner's Court's going to invest some of our local resources to repeat that success.
Great, wonderful. Laura, why don't you tell us about when we all vote, and walk us through some of what you think have been your most impactful moves so far. I know you're a little bit of a newer organization, so I'm excited to hear about it.
Yeah, so When We All Vote was founded in 2018. Our founder is Mrs. Michelle Obama, former First Lady of the United States. And really the goal of what we're trying to do is help educate, register, and mobilize young people and people of color. So we've really been on this same mission since 2018, but as you know, new challenges that we're facing have come up, including voter suppression bills in states like Georgia, Texas, Florida, Arizona. We started an advocacy program last year in order to inform our supporters of what's at stake and what they can do to actually do more in their communities to not only register voters, but to hold their elected officials accountable in order to make sure that more people have that access to voting in their communities in whatever way that may mean. So
Great.
We've really been doing the work since 2018 to register voters, but more so now, just more education, which we find is so important for people to really understand, especially young people, that while protesting matters, your vote also matters, and it must happen not just every 4 years, but every year. And we also know that 99% of all elected positions are at the state and local level. So also trying to help people understand what's on their ballot and to make sure that they know what they're voting for before going into the voting booth.
Great. So it seems to me that Christian and Laura, you both have a particular emphasis on younger voters. And I'd love to hear from you as to why. I mean, there are lots of different avenues that either of you could have gone down for your advocacy. And I'm wondering why you picked young voters to focus most of your efforts.
Yeah, I mean, so one thing, we're at the I'm the academic director of the Schwarzenegger Institute, which is at the University of Southern California. So by definition, a lot of the work that we do is educational and focused on our students who are interested in democracy. The program that we talked about previously was focused on providing nonpartisan philanthropic grants to places that had previously had histories of racial and ethnic discrimination. And so there we were less concerned about young voters, but more concerned about just making it easier to vote during COVID, providing voter access during a period that was really challenging. I'm really excited to hear that Remy said that the super centers that were funded by the Schwarzenegger Institute are potentially going to be able to continue in the future via government funding, because I do think to mobilize voters, to make it easier for people to vote, the private philanthropy that happened in 2020 is exciting, but it's not something that's sustainable to sustain voter access of young people or voters of color or voters broadly. You have to actually have the government pay to do so. And that happens at the local level, that happens at the state level, and that could potentially happen at the federal level, but really it's a local and state thing. So more funding, I think, could help young voters turn out more and help other voters turn out more.
Great. Laura?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen the energy from young people. They turned out in record numbers in 2020, and we're very much a part of that election cycle. And so a huge part of what we're trying to do now is continue that energy, continue that progress, and help young people who are really a stronghold, a part of these big movements that are happening across the country in the last couple of years, and help inform them on why these midterm elections matter and these local elections matter, and how to make their voices heard in those elections as well. So it really is a part of this is education and also reaching them where they actually are, which young people are mostly online. And so, I think it's important to recognize what we do at When We All Vote, which is we work with a lot of different influencers and celebrities, and we really plug ourselves into culture and media in order to deliver those messages in different ways. That is not just through traditional, what I feel like traditional campaigns are using. We're really investing in that online portion to reach people these young people where they are, and help make sure that they understand why their vote matters, why their voices matter, and that it can't happen just at protesting. It must also happen, with their ballot to make their voices heard.
Great. Remy, I would love to talk to you about something that Christian mentioned, which is that, there was a bunch of private money in 2020 for election administration. Governor Schwarzenegger's money, obviously, we're talking about that specifically, but also grants from Zuckerberg through CTCL and the Center for Election Innovation Research. So now that that money is not as accessible, are you concerned, or have municipal and government funding sources kicked in at the rate that you need?
Well, I don't think we're going to see the same level of investment that we got during the 2020 election from our local governments. I think we were able to show that certain things work and that people will utilize them using those funds. And so we're able to target more clearly what we're going to do during an election and how to access it. Our state recently put a law in that we're not allowed to accept private funds any longer unless we get clearance from the Secretary of State in advance. So, they found a way to cut off those resources that were available during that time. I certainly plan to be asking permission from the Secretary of State's office in the future for some projects that I kind of have in mind, and seeing if I can get support from the private foundations. But I think what was really important during that time was that things that we thought we needed to do, we were able to do. I think not only did the Secretary of State's office say that we had a smooth election during the 2020 election with all the complications it provided, but we had the same thing down here. We were able to do everything so it didn't impact the voters as they were going to the polls and what they were experiencing. We're able to maintain that consistency that's so important when it comes to voting.
Great. And I know that Governor Schwarzenegger, Christian, was mostly interested in person polling locations reopening for this go around. Can you talk about that specific interest of his and why you decided to make that a focus of your investment?
So one of the things we were interested in at the Schwarzenegger Institute, and one of the things Governor Schwarzenegger was particularly interested in creating this grants program, was the historical discrimination that had occurred in a lot of places that previously had been covered under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And so that Section 5 was gotten rid of back in, or Section 4, Section 5 was eliminated in 2013 by Shelby versus Holder. And so what that did in a lot of places was it led to reductions in polling places in those former VRA states. And so the focus was really to try to think about how can we make it easier to vote by providing the funds and the resources to election administrators, like people like Remy, who know what to do with the funds, that we don't. Like, how do we increase access in a nonpartisan way using funds in this really unusual election of 2020 with COVID? And then that hopefully will make it easier for people to vote. And so one of the reasons the genesis was about that is really the thinking about the historical discrimination, in places like Arizona and Texas and Louisiana and Georgia and North Carolina and South Carolina, in places that previously been covered by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act.
Okay, great. And then Remy, tell us about what you did to encourage in-person voting with that funding.
Well, one of the concerns people had during that time was going out in public and interacting with large groups. And we know polling places are concentrations of people from all across communities. And they didn't have access to the ability to vote by mail because in Texas, you have to be 65 or older, you have to be out of a county, and there's certain requirements. It's not open to everybody. And we knew there was that fear that was in the community. So by accessing those funds and creating those super centers, not only do we provide a much larger space for people to come and vote in person, but we were able to add polling locations within the 3 major communities here. We had Brownsville, we had Harlingen, and we had over on the Port Isabel area, which is next to South Powder Island. So we were literally able to cover all across the county with those funds and create those voting opportunities where people might not have come out and voted. They might have stayed home during that time. But thanks to those funds, I think we saw our highest turnout in Cameron County's history, what would have been the worst election held in Cameron County is what we all anticipated.
So, obviously the pandemic or the lack thereof is going to change a little bit of how our advocacy is done year over year, given the different situation that we're now in. And I would love to hear how that is affecting your strategy and the way that you're thinking about the upcoming midterms. Laura, why don't you talk to us a little bit about how When We All Vote is handling that?
Yeah. 2020 was definitely difficult for all voter registration organizations, as a lot of our efforts were done, partially in person. And you have to, in order to really be successful in voter registration, you have to have that face-to-face conversation. So while we did have a lot of, a lot of our efforts were digital, texting, digital ads, et cetera, you also really have to have that volunteer who has that face-to-face conversation in the community. That's really important. So it really in 2020 was a complete turnaround to only go digital, and we still were successful. We still registered about 500,000 people, and it was pretty amazing. At the same time, now we're shifting into this completely new, paradigm of what this midterm election will be like. And so we're trying to keep up with that, of course. So a huge part of this and of what we're doing this year is continuing to train massive amounts of volunteers on voter registration, exactly how to do it, exactly where to go in their community to do that, and have that face-to-face conversation. So 2 programs that we have, our chapter leader program, where they're volunteer leaders, and they are in key cities where they're able to go into community and kind of also train others in their community. And then we actually have some that are specifically targeting young people. On one in particular, we just launched called Vote Loud, which is on HBCU college campuses, where then they develop a voting squad on their own campus and go to places where they know that their peers are at on college campus, and to actually register them to vote. So we're doing a lot of really cool things, a lot of innovative things this year. As technology changes as well, we're also trying to do more with the technology that exists, where we're able to target those voters that we're trying to talk to and make sure that they have the information they need to how to register, especially as there are different, every state is different. And it is complicated for a young person to navigate. I mean, that's just the truth. So trying to make sure that we're getting it into the local community, but then those people can deliver the message to their family members and their networks on the ground, in order to make sure that we're turning out as many people as possible.
And, young people obviously vote at a lot smaller of a rate than I think a lot of folks would like. That is specifically difficult in a midterm, where young people feel even less engaged, and probably aren't as excited about people on the ballot as they are in a presidential election. So how do you change your messaging strategy from general to midterm?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and obviously a huge challenge for everyone working in this space during a midterm election year. So really, it starts with education and helping people understand who is on the ballot and who are you voting for, even though the president is not on the ballot. So letting them know that there are 425 members of Congress that are up in the House, and a handful of senators. I think it's about 25 senators, and then governors and mayors in key cities. I think it's about 25 major mayors up for election this year. So it's letting them know that how do those people then connect to your community? What are the decisions that they're making regarding schools and roads and those healthcare decisions that are affecting your family, so that they understand, the president isn't just the one that's doing that. So something that we've been doing is actually developing a lot of educational content on social media to say, this is how an attorney general affects what's happening in your local community, or how a secretary of state is affecting what's happening in your local community, or your school board, and why do they matter? Who are they? So just really helping them connect the dots so that they do feel some passion to go into the ballot box or fill out that mail-in ballot, and make their decisions, because it does affect them at the local level. So we're really trying to fixate on those local issues and how they connect to the people that are on their ballot.
Great. Remy, I kind of had the same question for you. This is going to be you mentioned record-breaking turnout in 2020, which is amazing. I'm going to go out on a limb and say we're probably not going to break any records this go around. So how does that change the way that you educate voters and interact with them from general to midterms?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges we have is letting people know that elections are happening. We've done some information reviews with college students, and really that was a concern that they weren't even aware that an election was going to occur. And that happens with even the places we host our polling locations at. They're always sort of surprised in November that we're going to be asking for a location. So getting that word out to the community that actually there is an upcoming election and what they're about. And you talked about engaging younger voters. We see the same pattern regardless of the election cycle, where you've got your 45 to 70-year-olds are our most active group. But it is true that the sooner you vote, the more likely you're going to vote again. And so engaging the high schools and the colleges has been a focus of our office as well, because we kind of feel like we need to get them voting early. But if it's getting the message out that something is happening, and then being able to go as deep as what Laura was mentioning, I think is going to be key to it. We don't necessarily do that type of advocacy from our perspective, because really it's providing the opportunities to vote and making sure that people are registered so that when they decide to participate, they can.
Great. And then Remy, I just want to stay with you for just a second. I know that implementing the new voting law in Texas was a bit of a challenge, especially in the initial primary. There were quite a lot of absentee ballot application rejections and ballot rejections themselves that went down pretty precipitously, which is a good thing in this last runoff. I'd love to hear more from you about the changes that you've had to make in Cameron County in order to make sure that you're adhering to this law. That, of course, new ID matching requirements for mail-in information was obviously a huge difference, but I'm sure that there are others that voters just really didn't see behind the scenes, and I'd love to hear about them.
Well, like I said, we usually want to make sure the voter has the same experience. And with the ballot by mail requirements that were put in place during that session, legislative session, it really changed the way all those voters were voting, because they were used to a certain pattern. And getting them first to understand that this had to be included on the application, and then again added to the new envelope design for the return envelope. It took a lot, because we tried to get—
And that was the driver's license number or the last 4 digits of the social security number, right?
Exactly. Or the other 2 or 3 that they allowed you to use. Because not everybody had that associated with their voter registration record. A lot of people that are registered at the time when it wasn't required to, and there wasn't a need for them to update it when they added it. So getting people to understand that, and we from the get-go pushed, use both. Don't just choose one. If you're not sure, fill out both of them, so that we could use every opportunity to make the connection to identify the voter. That first round, we had close to the 30%. The first round came back. Luckily, they added the cure provision, which we were very happy to see, because it really opened up the opportunity for people to fix their ballots because of technical issues. Because these ID numbers didn't really have anything to do with whether or not they were qualified to vote in the election. It was just an extra step they had to take in order to get their vote to count. It was like, an additional hurdle they had to jump to get it in. And so luckily people responded very well. People immediately were sending them back. They were coming by the office to fix them, because they recognized how important it was that their vote counted during this. One of the other things we saw was that a lot of people canceled their applications once they got that notice, and they went to the polls directly to vote, which is a disservice, because voting by mail is right for Texas if you're 65. And so having people have to switch their plan, I think was great that they did it, but it was bad that they had to do it because of this new requirement. And as for the other provisions that were included in there, we really worried that we were going to lose poll workers because of the new penalties that were added to simple mistakes, or just being accused of doing something and then having to defend it in court because a poll watcher didn't like the way you particularly managed your polling site. we thought we were going to have a lot of trouble, but our judges adapted quickly. We provided additional training and things of that nature to give them the confidence that they needed in the polling place.
Okay, great. And then Christian, I'd love to close out with you. I'd love to hear your perspective a bit nationally. What you're most concerned about, if there are any laws that have changed dramatically the way that folks are going to vote, and maybe we're not paying attention as much as we should.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll start with SB1 in Texas, which you and Remy were discussing, but think more broadly, because there are a lot of bills across the country and state legislatures, mostly that made it a little bit harder to vote, or that decreased voter access, or that made it really harder to vote, depending on the bill and depending on the state. SB1, for instance, like made it a state jail felony for election administrators and other people who work the polls to directly send applications for vote by mail ballots out to voters, right? That's some things that had happened in places like Harris County. It also closed 24-hour voting, which was something that had been done in Harris County. And, Harris County has the largest number of Black voters and Latino voters in the state of Texas, the overall number. The bill in general, there has done some things that I think is targeting voters of color. I do think there's some creativity happening with election administrators trying to work around some things. But I think in general, if we also can look at states like Alabama, states like Florida, states like Georgia have passed bills that also ban private funding, make it harder to vote, are doing some similar reductions to vote by mail. But in general, what should we learn from 2020? Making it easier to vote, more options, in-person voting, mail-in voting, election day voting. That is not an unfunded mandate, so you have to pay for that. All of those things cost a lot, right, to do all of those different types of voter access and different ways to vote. But in 2020, that's what was done because of health, and more people turned out to vote because there were more places and more options to vote. But all these state bills are coming in and making it so much harder and attacking particular types of voting. And that doesn't help, while banning private funding. And so, realistically, it'd be nice to see some states do more to empower local election administrators, spend more to empower local election administrators so they can do more types of voter access. I think the more constraints, SB1 putting constraints on poll workers, the more constraints there are, the harder it is for them to do their job and for people to vote. And so if you want to reduce voting, you pass bills like Texas's SB1. If you want to make it easier to vote, you empower local election administrators, you give people the funds they need to vote, and you allow people to have many options on the ground to participate in voting.
Okay, great. And Laura, close us out. Tell me about how your organization is adjusting to helping voters understand these laws that are often quite difficult to comply with.
Yeah, we're doing the organizing and education work, but I think what's important to note is, and I think any of my voter registration counterparts would say the same, is you can't out-organize voter suppression. And you have to have elected officials also take action in order for us to make our democracy work for everyone. And that's making it easier and more accessible for voter registration to happen and for people to turn out and actually make their voices heard. And, voter suppression is not new. This is something that has happened since the founding of our country, and it's just transformed into different ways. And I think exactly what Christian was talking about in Texas and in Harris County, which is where there's a large predominantly Black community and 44% more likely to have ballots rejected than in heavily white communities. These are the facts, and this is what's happening not just in Texas. There was over 500 bills proposed across the country in almost every state since the beginning of 2021, which were predominantly bills that were suppressing the vote. And so I think that's just important to note, and more people, or part of what we're doing is to educate people on that. This is what's happening. I think it's important to note, not everyone's turning on the TV and watching, CNN, whatever news outlet they're watching and getting that information. And so it's important that people are aware that this is even happening in their community, that long lines do mean voter suppression, that people are making it harder for certain populations, especially young people, Black and brown communities, and also Indigenous people. It's making it much harder to vote. And that is not an accident. And so our job is to make sure people, one, are aware of these issues and what's happening across the country, but two, what democracy really means. And it means equal access for all of us in order to make our voices heard in each and every election.
I really appreciate it, Laura. Thanks so much. Well, I think that's all the time we have. I really appreciate our panelists coming to have a conversation with us. I think this was really helpful. I know I learned something. So thanks so much for being here.